But I tried my first AA meeting as a 19-year-old in college. And I went to the meeting and I just pretty much ran out of the meeting as soon as it was over because I was agitated, ready to run because the God language so alienated me. So, having been raised Catholic with this very kind of conservative Catholic notion of what a God is, I thought that I'm in serious trouble if my way to get sober is to turn my life and my will over to this God who's got a plan for me, who's going to remove my defects of character, who's going to set me on the path, and my job is to stay out of the way. That conception of God never worked for me.
Hey, what's going on? Unlatched Mind, episode 57. My guest today is Peg O'Connor. Peg's a professor of philosophy, a recovering alcoholic, and among other things, an author. She just released a book titled "Higher and Friendly Powers: Transforming Addiction and Suffering." We discussed her book, and I think the main point we really touched on is her personal journey of fighting addiction and getting and maintaining sobriety. She was really hit with sort of a sort of a moral conflict with the definition of a higher of what her higher power was, with the definition of a higher power, which is really the underpinnings of a lot of the AA and recovery and the 12-step programs, where she had there was a conflict with her personally, and I'm sure many, of the definition of what that higher power is, juxtaposed to the traditional Judeo-Christian quote-unquote higher power. So anyway, it was a really interesting perspective she had on that. She also shared her personal story, which I think was really put context to her book and to her journey. So anyway, let's get going. I give you Peg O'Connor. All right. Well, Peg O'Connor, thank you so much. So we're going to talk about your book. Title of it's Higher and Friendly Powers: Transforming Addiction and Suffering. Before we do that, who is Peg? Get a little background on yourself.
Peg? So I am Peg O'Connor. A couple of crucial things to know about me. I am a philosophy professor for the last, about 28 years. I do a lot with moral philosophy, but actually now do a lot more with addiction and philosophy, because I think philosophy has a lot to offer people who are struggling with suffering and looking to make meaning and value in a world that seems remote or hostile or alien. And that's been the bread and butter of philosophy for millennia. So I'm a philosopher, and I'm also a recovering alcoholic. So those two things, philosophy and addiction, go hand in hand for me. They have since I was a very young person.
How long have you been, I guess the term is, how long have you been clean and sober?
I've been in recovery for 35 years. So that's a good long time. Wow. Yeah. I was fortunate that I sobered up early, just after I had graduated from college. I was very lucky in that regard. My life could have taken some very different turns. My life may have been foreshortened by decades if I had continued doing what I was doing.
Well, that's automatically strikes me as being probably not typical. I don't know. Maybe you have different. Maybe I'm wrong there. But where I feel like folks get older and then they start putting a label of addiction onto something that's affecting their marriage or their parenting or their job. You seem to have identified it pretty early.
I identified it early. I started drinking when I was about 13 or 14, right on the line there, and my drinking took off. Wow. It accelerated. And so by the time I was 15 or 16, I knew that I was drinking in ways that were very different from my friends. I knew that I couldn't stop once I got going. And I was having a lot of social ramifications from that. I almost got expelled from high school. I went to Catholic school. Maybe that's another thing to know about me. I went to Catholic school and I was totally drunk at a school dance. And before I went into a blackout, I remember saying to the nun who was chaperoning, "And your clothes are ugly too." And next, Monday at school over the intercom was Margaret O'Connor to the Dean of Discipline's office. And they threatened to expel me. They almost did, but they didn't. I was lucky. My dad knew the headmaster. They had been in Catholic school together as kids. So I got a pass there. But my parents didn't know what to do with me. So this was in the late 70s, early 80s. And thinking
Mm.
about young people having addictions, that just really wasn't in the scene. There wasn't a framework for that. And I think that's one of the good things that has happened, is that we're a lot more aware of
Yeah.
adolescent drug use and sort of the impacts on that, and being far more proactive in our drug education programs rather than good old Nancy Reagan saying, just say no.
Right. Right.
Not that that's very
Yeah.
effective. So I
Right.
knew early, and I knew that I would try to stop, and I'd stop for a while, and then I'd pick right back up again. And by the time I got to college, I was an athlete in college. I wouldn't drink during season. So I'd say, well, I don't have a problem because I can stop drinking. And then, like Mark
Mm.
Twain said, quitting smoking is easy. I've done it thousands of times. Yeah,
Yeah.
is
That's right.
what it was like. What is what it was like for me. So, by the
Mm.
time I was just shy of 22, I had a terrible car accident and I was almost killed. I hadn't been drinking, but I would have been. And I realized at that point, when I was offered all kinds of painkillers because I was in a lot of pain, I thought, Betty Ford, here I come. I knew how I had taken to alcohol, duck meat water, and I thought I would have the same thing with narcotics. So at that point, I decided to run an experiment, see how long I could go this time, because I had done it before and I had failed. So I see myself as still running that experiment. It makes me keep a very proactive relationship with my sobriety. And I got to be careful that I don't start taking it for granted or functioning on autopilot. And it's been good doing the kind of work on addiction that I do, because it keeps it real for me. It becomes very
Yeah.
easy
It's
as
always
we
top of
get,
mind. Yeah.
yeah. And it gets easy if it seems like a little tiny speck in the rearview mirror. We forget the warning that, objects are closer than they appear. But we think, oh, that was just so long ago. I'm such a different person.
Right.
I am, but there are still certain strands that run through me. So I
Mm.
don't know.
But
I always say to others, I don't know if I were to start drinking again, whether I would go back to that same very dangerous kind of drinking, but I choose not to find out. I choose
why?
not
Why?
to test
Yeah.
that hypothesis. I'm just
Mm.
going to keep running in this
Right.
direction.
Right. Because a lot of folks that when they do it when they get older have a tough time adapting to social situations and all the triggers that happen in your day to day life when drinking was part of your life was a lot pretty
Right.
easy. And then so running that experiment, it's just harder for folks. But it sounds like over the years, since you've been not drinking for so long, I'm sure you have little issue going out and mingling with people drinking. I assume I shouldn't assume, but
Mostly, but sometimes I I get really irritated, or I still feel left out at certain times. So I remember
mm,
um, with 9/11, that was absolutely horrific, and a lot of my friends were grieving and having a hard time, and they all decided that they wanted to go out to the bar, and I thought, I can't go to the bar with them. I mean, it was hard feeling like this is how people process grief or anger or uncertainty, and I can't do it
yeah,
that way. And
yeah,
so there are still times, and whether it's about me or part of my baggage, but I don't like being around people who are drinking a lot. I don't like being at activities where drinking is the center. So even all
mm,
these years later, you know work parties where there's alcohol, I usually choose not to go. Or big holiday shindigs where there is so much focus on alcohol, it's just not what I want to do. So even now, I still find myself needing to come up with strategies. I always say to people newly sober and sober a long time, always have an exit strategy when you head into a gathering. Take your
yeah,
own vehicle or be in charge of your own arrival and departure time. Have
right,
your reasons ready for why you're going to leave. And I'm so out about my recovery. I don't get this much anymore where people will start foisting drinks on me, or get
right,
really a little aggressive with me, kind of poking me. Well, why don't you drink? Why don't you drink?
right,
Because
right, right.
I think in those settings where people maybe are a little worried about their own drinking, they see someone else not drinking and they project onto me the fact that, oh, am I watching them? Am I keeping track? And the answer is no. You do you. I love my students taught me the expression, that's a you thing. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
I just choose not to put myself in
Yeah.
situations like that.
Yeah. Well, the reality is, it we do live in a alcohol soaked society. I mean,
Oh,
it's not
mhm.
It really, I mean, one of your blogs I had caught, it said something like, and I thought about this when it happened during the pandemic, liquor stores were considered, essential businesses. And I think your
Yes.
blog was, hey, let's ask this question. Why are liquor stores considered essential businesses? I mean, it makes you think. They are, in our society, they are actually essential. And
Sales
that's
were
kind of sad.
sales were through the roof, and we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing the effects of that, where the estimated number of preventable alcohol related deaths has gone through the roof. It actually now outnumbers the number of deaths from overdose. I mean, so alcohol is this drug that people treat differently as a kind of drug, and think about, we say alcohol
Yeah.
and drugs. No, alcohol is a drug, but I think we still like to have
Right,
a
right, right.
distinction between, well, there are the okay drugs, alcohol, and marijuana's kind of worked its way into that category in a
Right,
very
right,
kind
right,
of
right, right.
seismic shift in perception about alcohol. But then we like to have this idea, well, then there are the really bad drugs. There's meth, there's heroin, there's cocaine. And so it kind of gives these other drugs a bit of a pass because we think, oh, they're not as bad, they're not as dangerous. And that distinction is dangerous and not actually all that viable.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's somewhat arbitrary. I mean, it's
Hmm.
I would see maybe there's extremes. You get to the meth and heroin. Okay, I can see that being less manageable for most people, but and the line is drawn based on politics and agendas of the folks with the
Hmm.
power. I mean, right? I mean, you could make that argument about so many things. I think they're doing more and more studies about psychedelics now that are just like they're not that harmful. Now, a lot of folks don't all agree with that, but it used to be the thing like you're crazy if you ever touch that kind of stuff. And you could argue that alcohol is more damaging to the human body. Now, I don't know if that data is completely consistent, but it seems to be
It, it,
changing a little
it,
bit. What are,
it's interesting.
you
I
know,
mean, alcohol withdrawal is the one
yeah,
kind of withdrawal you can die from. Let's be clear on that.
you can actually
So
die from. Yep,
you
yep,
can die from it. Yep.
exactly. Yeah,
And the thing about the
yep,
psychedelic drugs, I mean, up until the early 1970s, there was some good research being done on the role of psychedelic drugs in treating other kinds of mental health concerns, including addiction. And
yeah.
then all of that,
Addiction is one of them.
with the
Right, right.
war on drugs, all of that research just got shelved for about the last
It
35
did.
years. And it's just coming back now, where MDMA is showing some real promise, for example, in dealing with severe depression and with PTSD. So you're absolutely right that certain drugs get socially and politically coded, and then we do no
Hmm.
research on them, and then it turns out, gosh, maybe these could be helpful if they're administered under the right kinds of circumstances. So the other thing that happens, though, is, so here's all these clinical test trials being run, say at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere. Then people think, oh, well, I can get some magic mushrooms from the local guy down the street, or I can start licking
Right,
frogs in a national park, whatever the heck that has been about, and think we're going to have these great,
right,
wonderful
right.
kind of experiences where suddenly I'm not going to feel anxious anymore, or my PTSD will be relieved. And it is worrisome, but it's promising
Right.
too. So I'm really excited by
Yeah.
that work being done.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the internet's helped. I mean, that we all can just consume information and get the data now, as opposed to just turning on the one of three news stations and hearing what the politicians are saying. Right? Remember the whole cracked egg. Here's your brain on drugs. I mean, that
Oh
scared everyone,
yeah.
or a lot of people anyway. But it wasn't. There's
Yeah,
no
dare
nuance to
dare to
that. It's
keep
like,
your kids off drugs. I mean, you probably went through
yeah,
that.
yeah,
That
yes, that
was
was
a little
my,
bit
yeah,
after me. So but that was your
yep,
drug
yep,
education. We see how effective that is as a.
yep, yep.
Oh,
But anyway, so your book is, you sent me the highlights, and I appreciate that. And there were just enough detail to really give me a picture of what it's what the main themes are you're trying to touch on. So, I mean, what you've been in recovery for a long time, like you just articulated. Obviously, that fed a lot of the inspiration for the book, I would imagine.
yes, in an odd sort of way. So here's what I mean by that. I was someone
Hmm.
who sobered up without AA and without professional treatment, which is actually what a lot of people do. So I'm not all that unusual. But I tried my first AA meeting as a 19-year-old in college, and I went to the meeting and I just pretty much ran out of the meeting as soon as it was over, because I was nice and polite. I would never leave something in the middle of it before it was finished, but I was just, agitated, ready to run. because the God language so alienated me. So having been raised Catholic with this very kind of conservative Catholic notion of what a God is, I thought that I'm in serious trouble if my way to get sober is to turn my life and my will over to this God who's got a plan for me, who's going to remove my defects of character, who's going to set me on the path, and my job is to stay out of the way. That conception of God never worked for me. And so I never went back to an AA meeting until I had been about 19 years sober, because I thought I need to do something different. I'm in a different phase of
Wow.
my life. Maybe I should try again. I had realized that I was, running on autopilot, that certain things were starting to feel familiar in a way that I didn't want to have happen again. And I found that I still had the same reluctance about that conception of God, but I also found that I liked many of the people. So I was curious about how could AA be more inviting to people who aren't believers in a very Christian notion of God, or at least a notion of God that's very providential. And so this book, Higher and Friendly Powers, in some way is my letter to my 19-year-old self to say, wait a minute, there's so much going on with that conception of higher powers. If we go back to the root source of it, which was in American philosopher William James's great work, The Varieties of Religious Experience. So my hope in this book is twofold, or maybe I'm trying to aim it towards a very impossible audience. People who absolutely love AA and for whom it's worked, to learn more about William James, whom the founder of AA regarded as an important intellectual co-founder of that program. And people who struggle with AA, who feel like, I feel like a liar or a fraud because I don't believe in that God. I don't believe that God has a will for me. And to maybe help people be able to accept different conceptions of higher power that might help them to reap some of the benefits of the program.
Now, is that the current? I don't know much about the. I've actually had friends, family members that have gone through the 12-step program and AA. Is it now? Most of them actually are Christian, so there would be less of a conflict in them, in themselves. Just knowing knowing the folks that I know and how the program works. Is it? Are the programs currently the same, or have they moved towards more of an agnostic, higher powered concept that would be more amenable to what you're talking about?
So it's a very interesting thing, Alcoholics Anonymous. There's a centralized office that deals with business things, but every AA meeting can have a distinct character from all others, because AA is both a program of recovery. So there's the book Alcoholics Anonymous, there are the 12 steps, that there is a program that goes with it, but it's also the fellowship, which is the people. So in any one particular, let's say you're in an urban area, you might go to an AA meeting that is very traditional and very much has that Christian-centric notion of God, even with the proviso in the 12 steps, God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us. And many of those prayers end with the Lord's Prayer, with the Our Father, which is a very Christian prayer. Mm-hmm. Other meetings in the same city might have completely, I don't know what would be a nice way to put this, kind of removed the God language and instead said higher power and take out the pronouns to have a more inclusive and expansive sense. So part of the difficulty is, particularly with someone who's newly sober, they might not know what kind of meeting they're walking into. And if they are Christian, they may feel very at home right away to hear that language. There's an all-loving God who's going to take care of you. And if you're not Christian, if you come from a different faith tradition, or you're an atheist or an agnostic, it can feel very alienating and sometimes even hostile. So I know, for example, some of the meetings I went to were more straight up Christian, and they would end it by saying, would all who care to join us in the Lord's Prayer please do so? So I wouldn't. And people would regularly say to me, why aren't you joining us? Well, because you just said, anybody who wants to, go ahead and do it. Happy to have you do that. But I didn't want to say that prayer. So, for many people, AA is the only game in town. It's free. You can make a donation of $1 if you want to help support your your local meeting. But it's widely available. And if more and more people are struggling with alcohol, different kinds of drug usage, alcohol, or different kinds of behaviors like gambling, it may be the only option in town for them, because treatment is inaccessible in so many ways for people, whether there just aren't any treatment centers, whether one's work situation doesn't allow it, whether one doesn't have insurance. I mean, all those sorts of things. So I guess my hope is just trying to make something that's widely available a little more perhaps open and inviting to others.
Yeah, the little bit I read on it, it kind of it basically alluded to. I mean, it alluded to what you just summarized, where they it's almost like this, not franchise is not the right word, but each individual location can have they have a lot of freedom as to what they emphasize, what they de-emphasize. Are we whitewashing the concept of God? Is it a lowercase g? Is it an uppercase G? When they say he is is it capital H? So yeah, I could see that being, and whatever your belief system is, an AA, unless it's a hardcore Christian program, then say it. Right, say it, but that's going to be a barrier to a lot of folks, like you said. So, but I feel like they're trying to toe a line, and I might be completely wrong with this, but even when I see almost like it's an allegory to like our country, our presidents still, right? We're based on Judeo-Christian principles. We've kind of come away from that, right? We've come away from that, but our presidents still say the word God, and it's always, you always hear them it's still obviously on our money. It's not. And I don't want to get into the discussion of whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing, but we are in this weird sort of dichotomy about when the president says God, we're a country of all different belief systems. So which God is he talking about? Because, and I get into this discussion with folks a lot. They don't even all allow the existence of the other. Like, so it's this weird kind of dichotomy where it's like, now maybe everyone can just hear it the way they want to hear it, and it speaks to them, and that's a place of unity. But it's always been a rough one for me to, like, are we saying we're Christian? We used to be Judeo-Christian, right? And now the world's gotten much different, and we're open the border. We want everyone here. If you're going to be a contributing member to society, that's our whole point. But then it gets weird. It gets really weird. So it's almost, I just feel like it's almost an allegory to what you mentioned about AA. They don't know where to, and maybe it's okay. Maybe it's the balance we need, and maybe it's that tension is a healthy tension. I don't know.
I don't disagree that tensions can be healthy, and I mean, I think about the thing about the U.S. that is interesting is that the intellectual forefathers. So I don't mean Thomas Jefferson. I mean the philosophers from whom Thomas Jefferson was drawing, for example, in the Declaration of Independence. So that was John Locke. John Locke, British philosopher in the 1600s. And John Locke, in many ways, was a heretic. He didn't believe in the Blessed Trinity. And, so there you have this kind of, in some ways, Christian, but a heretic. But it's the intellectual foundation for Thomas Jefferson and for the Declaration and for our Constitution, where there was always a fundamental tension in there. And that I think the founding fathers couldn't get away from it because that was their intellectual framework, but they were wary about it. I mean, there's a reason why Thomas Jefferson had the expression "a wall between church and state," because he was worried about individual states at that time imposing religions on geographic areas. And that's what he was trying to block. So it's just amazing. You're right. This is another subject, but the way in which freedom of religion has been inverted. It really was originally intended as freedom from having religion foisted upon you by a state entity.
Yeah, and honestly, and I've heard I've been in dialogues where it's the exact opposite. Where no, we should be a Christian nation. That's what the intent was. The intention was not to, the intention was not to remove God. It was to, they didn't want the Church of England to be governing the states or the other way, basically. And it's like, I just interpret it as there is that tension has always been there, exactly like you just said. And I don't know if anyone can truly, navigate that without getting a little bit, well, I'm not quite sure what, it's just, I agree. It's just like sort of a healthy tension is the only way I can land on it. And I think that's, I don't know, people smarter than me will probably figure that out someday, but I don't know.
Or they won't figure it out, and we'll just keep hammering on each other. It seems to be the MO these
well, that's
days.
the thing I always go to. That is exactly right. I'm becoming a broken record. We have these deep conversations, and sometimes they get like, I don't know, just I won't say violent. I never get violent. It's like loud and passionate. And it's like, if we just hugged each other after every conversation, no matter who you're having an argument with, I think the world would be a better place. But on the internet, you can't do that. So it just ends in
that
vitriol most times.
Well, and I think what happens is we fail to see the humanity in the other. We fail to see the humanity of the person with whom we're arguing with, because I reduce you to a position. Everything about you that may matter to who you are.
Your ideas.
I'm going to reduce you, you crazy pro-lifer, you crazy pro-abortion. I mean, it's all reductionist.
Yep.
We've lost a lot of abilities to engage in critically productive kinds of dialogue. Because you can't reduce it to 140 characters. You can't reduce it to a soundbite. So, I mean, I think 100%. That's part of the tragic.
And it takes a lot of work. And it takes a lot of work to have conversations and really go against your gut to see someone else's position. And, it's hard. And we don't have time. A lot of people don't have time. We're just going to work.
Or they choose not to take time. Yeah.
That's true as well.
Or the thing is, do I think the First Amendment, freedom of speech, is absolutely vital? Of course I do. But for me, every right has a flip side, which is a responsibility. So I'd like to talk more about our responsibility to listen and to listen charitably. We don't talk as much about that. And, we get so busy focused on my rights, individual rights. We forget to think about, to borrow an expression from a Native American philosopher, Daniel Wildcat, instead of thinking about inalienable rights, what if we thought about inalienable responsibilities? You fundamentally turn that worldview on its head. And I think, if we were to think more about our relationships of responsibility that we have to particular others, so our families and close community members, and then continue to expand that gives us some really rich language to talk about so much of what is happening in the country that isn't going to be reduced to about a 4-shot exchange, about my individual rights, my rights. It's like, that's not productive anymore. So I'd much rather talk about inalienable responsibilities.
I like
Far
that.
more interesting and productive. Yeah.
So when am I going to see Dr. O'Connor on the political ballot on stage?
That's a fun, of all the things I would never ever do, that would be right up the top of it, is to run for office.
The worst job in history. Yeah. I'm with you there.
And I'm so grateful to people who do it with the right spirit and who really do it because they want to make change, even where I fundamentally disagree with them. If I can disagree with someone's principles, I feel like I've got a chance to understand them and we can still connect. But if I can't understand the principles someone is operating under, or they aren't operating under any moral principles, but except just kind of bare naked, ruthless ambition, I don't know what to do with them.
Exactly. And unfortunately, the latter is what comprises many of who we see on the stage today. Unfortunately, ruthless ambition.
That. Yep.
Yeah, unfortunately. So getting back to your book, so this concept of a higher power. So I don't know, how did you come to terms, and how do you ended up settling on a definition of what, to sort of leave that Christian-centric God definition, and have you replaced that with something in that you think works?
So the term higher power and higher and friendly power or powers comes from the American philosopher and psychologist William James in his book, his 1902 book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. So there's an intellectual story to be told here. So Bill Wilson was the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. So in 1934, he went to the Charles B. Towns Hospital in New York, and he's utterly defiant. He's broken, and he screams, if there is a God, show yourself. I'll do anything to have this desire to drink be lifted from me. And the story goes, he felt this gust of wind, and suddenly his desire to drink was lifted. And so not long after, he's worried, am I going crazy? Which would make sense because he's probably going through acute alcohol withdrawal, probably hallucinating from that. And they used belladonna at the time, which could also induce hallucination. So he's got a twofer going here. And a friend gave him William James's Varieties of Religious Experience to understand what had happened to him as a kind of conversion. Now, here's the interesting thing. I would take it as a definitive treatment of the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called Writing the Big Book. Came out about 2 years ago. Schauberg is the author's name. And that story may be a bit of mythology on the part of Bill Wilson. Maybe it didn't really happen like that, but every program that's founded needs a good origin story that functions like a mythology. So in Varieties that Bill Wilson did read, we know he read it at least once and maybe another couple of times. Many of the stories in there are people who undergo a similar kind of tsunami-like conversion for him, where suddenly something happens that is so big and grand that a fundamental experience, a change like that, must have been authored by something external to the person. It feels like a god just swooped in. So, the paradigm case is Saul riding to Damascus and he gets knocked off the horse and then he becomes Paul and he becomes a Christian. And Bill Wilson said that's kind of what happened to me with drinking. And so in James's Varieties, though, he talks about what Bill Wilson, he describes the sort of experience that Bill Wilson has as a conversion. And what James says is that the only thing we know about a conversion is that it's a psychological process. It feels like it must be caused by something because it seems to come out of the blue. It's not like we consciously thought of it and then we change, but it's something just kind of flows through us. And he said, but the most we're licensed to say is it's a psychological conversion. And he goes on to say, people who really do want to change, oftentimes they've been thinking about this. In the back of my head, I had the voice at first saying a whisper, you got a problem, you drink too much, and then the whisper shout, you drink too much, and then the real shout in my head. And what James says is that thoughts and feelings can come unbidden from the subconscious and they burst through, and that's what a conversion is. And he goes on to say that people who are ready for a conversion oftentimes understand sort of how their present ways of living are wrong or incomplete or making them dreadfully unhappy. But they also have to have something that his expression is they long to compass. You've got to have a positive ideal of some sort. You've got to have something that is just a little bigger and better to kind of grapple hook your way towards. And that's what he calls a higher and friendly power. And he says anything can be a higher and friendly power. Anything larger will do. So some of the examples that James offers comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was William James's intellectual godfather, talking about the transcendental ideals of truth and beauty, something bigger than you. He said moral decency, your moral principles, enthusiasm for humanity. He says the belief in an immanent divinity of nature, even a better version of yourself. All of those things, he says, are expansive. They help a person both reach out of their own little embattled selves to something bigger out there, or it helps them to reach inward to themselves to find something more expansive there that helps them to begin to reach out and expand rather than contract. And when you think about the ways that addiction makes many of us contract our lives, so if things start to get in the way of our using, if friends are always hassling us like, you drink too much, we tend to drop those friends. Or we tend to drop activities maybe if they're going to interrupt our using. So our world, addiction, oftentimes our world shrinks in a kind of way.
You move more inward.
Recovery is a kind of expansion or inflation of that world again. But it happens from people changing drastically. And James is very clear, though, that there's just as many gradual conversions as there are the sudden ones. The sudden ones are big and flashing. They capture our attention. And much of, particular, in Catholicism, the saints, those people who undergo remarkable transformation and they suffer in all these kinds of ways. And, their spiritual impulses burn so brightly. What James says is many people have profound experiences and changes in their life that have happened very slowly and gradually as a result of making small changes incrementally, but the result is just as big. And so I think that's really important for people struggling with addiction. So if you have read the book Alcoholics Anonymous, called The Big Book, Bill Wilson talks about his own experience very early on. And I know many people early in sobriety might say, but I never had that big aha kind of tsunami moment. Maybe I'm really not an alcoholic, or maybe I'm really not an addict. Maybe I don't really belong here. And Bill Wilson understood the way that his story functioned normatively or prescriptively. So he did later write a second appendix called Spiritual Experiences, I think it is, where he talked about those more gradual kinds of conversions, because that's what many people have who do change their relationship to alcohol and other drugs and other kinds of behaviors. So this book, Higher and Friendly Powers, is really also intended to offer more options about what a higher and friendly power can be. There are as many higher and friendly powers as there are individuals in the world. It's up for us to decide what can function in that way, and that may change over time, because we humans are always changing, and that's the really good news. That's a really exciting news.
So, what gosh, it's almost ubiquitous now. I feel like we hear. I feel like the word addiction used to be. I don't know. Maybe it's as I'm getting older, so my perspective or perceptions changed when I was a kid to now. But I feel like it's so ubiquitous now. Everyone seems to be battling something. I know with the what is it, the benzos and all these, the pharmaceutical
Mhm.
companies are certainly involved in making it so accessible to so many people. But then I just take a step back and say, well, okay, well, that's just availability. But what is, and it's a simple question. It's a simple question, a hard answer. But what are we all trying to medicate away from? What are we losing? Like, what, you know what I mean? There's is it, I mean, you can go back down and down the list of causes of addiction, and I think there's a lot of things we're learning, but there's no silver bullet there. But man, it seems like we're all just really in pain, trying to dull something or escape reality. What's going on?
I think that's really interesting. So you're absolutely right that in part this is a supply side creation. So what's really escaped notice is the way that the rate of prescriptions for benzos is
Mm,
almost has increased almost as much as the rate of prescriptions for the opioids. That's garnered all the attention. So we have more people now being prescribed benzos, and the number of pills in each
mm,
prescription has grown as well. And benzos are used a lot for anxiety and stress. So who's getting prescribed a lot of these are middle-aged women, which is really
mm,
interesting when you think about the kinds of stresses that many women are under. So, I'm 57 years old, and I have friends who are caring for their own very elderly parents,
yeah.
and maybe their adult children are struggling, and they're doing a lot of childcare for their grandchildren. So you
Mm,
have a lot of, you know, late 70s, 60s. I have friends who have parents, they're in their 70s and their parents are still alive. So the kinds of stresses where
mm,
a lot of people aren't sleeping well, not eating well, money is tight, all these different kinds of stresses. And sort of one of the easiest ways to treat it is with a benzo. Well, let's just get some Ativan for you. Hopefully that'll
mm,
work. And partly the issue is then you start mixing medications. So a lot of people who might be on an antidepressant are prescribed a benzo, and then if you add alcohol in that mix, it's just a nightmare. And
mm,
so, yes, you're absolutely right. There's supply side creation, but the demand in some ways growing because people are suffering and they are struggling in all different kinds of ways. And when it seems as if things really aren't going to get better, whether financially or socially, for whatever kinds of reasons, it's hard not to become resigned to that in a kind of way, or even worse, fatalistic. Well, this is the kind of shit
mm,
that just happens to people like me, or this is what happens,
Right.
If economically we have become so insecure, we don't know whether we'll be able to hold on to our house, or we don't know whether our kids are ever going to be able to leave our own house. So I think the kinds
Yeah.
of stresses and anxieties that are out there are through the roof. And so people are looking for various ways, not necessarily to escape them, maybe to some degree, but I think to try to live through the stresses.
Mm.
So,
Take the edge off. Yeah.
unless and until we get some pretty significant changes. I mean, I think the pandemic combined with all the insecurity about inflation, for example, I mean, there's a reason why, that expression, deaths of despair. I mean, this is an economic
Mm.
issue very much as well, that there are certain swatches of the country who feel like we're getting left behind. We have no choice. Everything is being taken from us, become resigned, become fatalistic. I mean, when you take a
Yeah.
look at the increase, you know, death rates in certain populations, and that too has to go hand in hand with many communities of color feeling under the gun in all different kinds of ways. So you're starting to see certain drug usage tick back up there as well. And
Mm.
so for me it's about suffering, and how do you transform that? How do you make meaning out of suffering? And so, Nietzsche, said that human beings suffer, that doesn't make us unique, but how do we make meaning from that suffering, and how do we transform it? I mean, that's what human beings can do. But suffering that seems meaningless is the most torturous, he says. And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
are feeling as if their lives are just an existence of suffering with no meaning. And that's absolutely horrifying and tragic.
And some would, and yeah, I was going to ask you about the meaning thing, because I do, there's a whole side of me that thinks it is a sort of a denigration of, or a weaning of the meaning. Folks don't really feel like we have a meaning anymore. And I could I could make the argument that, well, the more that God is removed, right, or then I can see that, well, why are we here? Aren't we just a bunch of little atoms floating around for no purpose? And when things get hard, it's like, well, I only got 30 more years and I'm gonna be dead, so who cares, right? But going back to your point, perhaps higher power could fill that void in a sense. If maybe it's not quite religious, but if there's coping mechanisms that that put some value on a higher power as they define it, it could perhaps get them out of that funk to some degree. um, I don't
I
know.
think so. So one of the Bruce Alexander, who's done wonderful, and Johann Hari have done wonderful work on addiction and sort of what are the causes of it. And neuroscience has taken a turn where we like to talk about now addicted brains, or brains that have been hijacked by drugs
Mm,
that muck up our dopamine reward system, and all of that. And then Bruce Alexander and Johann Hari talk about the ways that you can't underestimate, and you must include the kind of environmental considerations that go into people deciding to pick up alcohol or other drugs, or start engaging in other behaviors that are readily available in a kind of way. And they talk about the kinds of radical dislocation and disconnection from others that it does when there's a lot of suffering happen. I think that a lot of people kind of revert back to either their own small selves, right? It's just me against the world, or I've got to take care of my family first. If I can't feed my family, if I can't make sure that they are okay, then I'm failing in a kind of way. And it becomes harder to pick your eyes up and look at a slightly broader horizon, where how do we think about community well being? Because where communities are thriving, there are social connections, and those social connections are what contribute to the thriving. So I know, sociologists and economists have been looking at the ways in which public goods are shrinking in a kind of way that keep people from engaging with others in myriad ways, making connections. And what was the book, Bowling Alone? So, for example, that there
mm,
used to be very rich social groups and happenings and activities around after work activities. There used to be bowling leagues. So I grew up in central Massachusetts where we had bowling alleys all over the place. And those bowling alleys had different leagues every night. And it was people out, it was families out gathering together. But many of that was through people's employment. So, the Asher Pant may sponsor a bowling team or a softball team. And when all those jobs disappeared, those kinds of leagues disappeared, and those ways of making connections with people that you might not otherwise. So I mean, I think it is just absolutely so complicated. But the move to make it be all about some of us have defective brains, because alcohol or drugs have either screwed them up or we were already predisposed to develop an addiction. I find those non-starters in conversation, because you can say to me, Peg, you were predisposed to develop an addiction. And I might say, that's not really the interesting question. The interesting question, though, is why did I start using? What activated that predisposition? Because you can have a predisposition that never gets activated, but what activates it in the kind of way? So, all the money now is being put in brain research. And I think it's important to do it, but there's got to be a complementary track that looks at, I know they talk about the social determinants of health, which is a really dry way of talking about it, in the sense of why are some people just more vulnerable to really bad health? Well, maybe because they have no access, or the choices they face aren't just a rock and a hard place, but it's a rock, a hard place, quicksand, and a cesspool with a swamp off to the side.
Right.
So, unless and until we start talking about those factors, we're never going to be able to grapple with questions of addiction in ways that affect long-term significant change. We're still going to keep shoving it on to the person, new language, but still it's got something to do with the individual and not with the rest of the social, economic, political, moral world order.
Yeah, I mean, it's the age-old question: heredity versus environment, right? Isn't that what we're saying? I mean, it seems like it's probably both, but you certainly cannot ignore the social.
It's a both and.
Yeah.
But so, for example, the U.S. government and the National Institutes of Mental Health have now prioritized funding that targets, genetic markers, biomarkers in the brains for various kinds of mental disorders, at the expense of looking at what are other kind of interventions or behavioral techniques that we might use to stave off the development of mental illnesses, or give people more ways to deal with, live through mental disorders that aren't requiring immediate pharmaceutical interventions. So we now put all the money towards, let's look at the genetics and then figure out how we can manipulate the chemistry, rather than saying there are some time proven techniques that can help lessen and delay, say, the onset of a psychotic episode in a young person, for example, who might be, schizotypal, who could go on to get full schizophrenia. Those kinds of programs aren't being funded anymore.
Yeah. Well,
so
I
it's a significant
sure
loss.
The lobby of big pharma is certainly going to be pushing that one side you spoke about, not the other, right? If we could find,
and that side's winning.
Oh yeah. It's amazing how much you always follow the money with most things, right? But it's amazing what big pharma has. I hear that term, and sometimes these people roll their eyes. Oh, you always hear that. But if you really dig into a lot of our problems, man, big pharma is behind a lot of it, in my opinion. If you really, because now, if in your example, if you can find that genetic marker, that's the problem. Now I can find a pill that'll solve that, or override that genetic deficiency, or whatever it might be. It's a lot. It's a lot more sexy than the other approach that you articulated, which is more of a slow, healthy. Let's have healthy responses to our stimulus. Let's understand some of the childhood trauma I went through. Let's talk about, like, whatever it might be. The other side is much more sexy and much more lucrative, right? I mean,
well, and allegedly faster. Right? It's much easier to take a pill than it is to, let's be in therapy and learn some behavior modification techniques. Let's learn some self-soothing techniques. So when you start to feel yourself ramp up, here are some things you can do. And it's so hard. I mean, I am not a parent, but I've certainly talked to enough parents of my own students and friends who are parents who, if they have a child who is struggling in different kinds of ways, where one of the first stops is to their physician, to their pediatrician, and begin to wonder, does my child have anxiety disorder, or does my child have ADHD? Because parents want for their children to do well, and they want to figure out the best ways of doing it. And I think we live in a culture now where medical authority has been so elevated that it becomes kind of much easier to get into the medicalized tracks of diagnosis, even in elementary school. And I think that so many parents struggle. They want to do right and well by their children. And if their doctors are saying, this is the thing to do, I say this to you as a parent, right? I mean, what do? You want to do right by your child. Sure. And sometimes it's treated as it's a disjunction. You're either going to go this way or that way. It can't be a both and. And that's my worry. We've always got a disjunction going rather than this should be a both and at the same time. And say many of the drugs that were originally reduced as antidepressants were meant to be part of a both and. Yeah. Take these drugs to kind of give you a chemical boost to, stabilize or reach a certain level where then you'd be able to do the work in therapy, where then you'd be able to do the kinds of, training and different kinds of behavior modification where this may not be a forever drug, but we're giving young children forever drugs with writing prescriptions off label because they weren't tested in kids. So that's worrisome in all kinds of ways.
Yeah. A lot of profit. So, I mean,
and follow the money.
Follow the money. Yeah. You can't. Yeah. And it's hard. Like I said, parents, I mean, you're told that you trust, you want to be able to trust your medical professionals.
Yes.
I'm always a trust but verify guy. But even in that case, I don't have that much time to go doing all my own research. Oh, maybe this might work, or maybe that might work. It's like we're paying all this money for insurance. Our medical professionals saying, "Here, this is the best thing for now. Take the pill." Okay, and it's the best for our child. Okay, well, I got to move on with things and just hope that's the best. It's hard. It's hard. Hard is the only word I can think of. It's crazy.
Yes,
but
it is. It is.
Now, one thing I want to ask you, and this gets a little personal, but you started drinking at 12 or 13, and if it's too personal, just say 13, next topic.
13 or so, yeah.
What the heck? What little insight was going on back then, or were you just, or do you not? Or was mom, dad?
I grew up in a great home, loving parents, and all of that. But I started to get the sense that I liked girls. And so there I am in a Catholic context thinking, wait a minute, I'm different from my friends in these kinds of ways. And I felt so socially awkward. And I always felt like, am I somehow going to be found out? Can everyone just, read what must be written across my face that, I might be, and I'll use the language of the time. I might be queer. I might be a dyke. I mean, and those were all meant as pejoratives. And so I drank to try to fit in. To maybe shake off some of my nervousness. But I would always kind of drink right past that. So sort of the shame about maybe my sexual orientation became compounded by the shame that I had about drinking differently from my friends. So it just became this big kind of snowballing shame. And that just continued to drive my use in all kinds of ways. Then I became ashamed that I wasn't doing as well in school as I probably should have. I became ashamed that I was wasting my educational opportunity. I mean, I think shame is one of those things. It's very opportunistic, and I could get my shame to attach to anything. Yeah. I was also a competitive tennis player, and so I'd be ashamed if I missed a ball. Every shot was a referendum on my moral worth. Every shot, every point. Every game, every set, every match. And it just became, I was beating up myself for absolutely everything. And alcohol aided and abetted that. Full stop. That's as simple as it gets.
So you think, that was the smoking gun. You weren't going to fit in. You didn't like boys. So you feel like that set you down now it is,
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is sad when you I was just having this conversation with friends over the weekend, or during this week actually, and it's like the damage, a society's acceptance or lack thereof of a person, the damage, the long-standing damage that can do, right? It's sad. I feel for folks like, it's like it's crazy, just that ability
we internalize
not to,
it.
yeah, because you just don't feel like
We
there's any other
internalize
option.
it, so then we can be judge, jury, and executioner 24/7. We are never outside the gaze of that judgment because we've internalized it always.
Yeah.
And that's the vicious thing about internalizing, oppressive stereotypes or oppressive beliefs about people like you. And then you can fill in, what that like you is, whether you're a woman, whether you're gay or lesbian, whether you are fully able-bodied or disabled. I mean, all these sorts of things. And we get really good at completely painting ourselves with a very broad brush.
We do. Man, sometimes I'm like, as humans, we're awesome. Other days I'm like, man, we suck as humans. I just don't, we just.
But we can't end on that note. We suck.
No,
as humans
that's a good point.
Because that's good point. No, we're not going to end there because I think one of the things that I love about William James is he talks about the ways that, not that we have a self. There's no kind of static, authentic, standing self that we always are. He talks about the way we're always selving. We're always in process. We're always changing. Yeah. We're changing as our material bodies change. We're changing as our clothes change. We're changing as our social commitments change. We change as our intellectual interests change.
Yeah.
And that human beings are capable of remarkable transformation. And his language is wonderful. He says, we can be rejuvenated, we can be regenerated, we can be transformed, we can be reborn, we can become people whose lives now are oriented around gratitude rather than grievance. We become people who are living and willing to live on possibilities and maybes, and that we can have faith. And faith is just simply a willingness to live on a maybe or a possibility where the results aren't certified in advance. Yeah. We can have faith that we can be different and better people. We can have faith that we can maybe make better lives for our kids. And our having that faith is what helps to bring about the fact that we do that. And so that relationship between faith and fact, and sort of what we are able to do when we're willing to do it, not just when we wish to do things, but when we're willing to do things, is utterly remarkable. And so at the end of the day, I am an optimist by nature. I am someone who wants to live in gratitude and keep grievances away from me as far as I can get them. And I know that sometimes I, like anyone else, can get in my, whiny, why me kind of feeling aggrieved about everything. But then that's also an opportunity for me to kind of check myself to say, what's going on that suddenly you think everything is about you? And the fact that, the universe is conspiring against you because you've hit three red lights in a row. Stop it. So, to see opportunities, there are opportunities and struggles, and many struggles are unwanted. My addiction was an unwanted opportunity, but now I wouldn't change it. And not just because I'm grateful to be sober. I'm grateful for this condition, a limiting condition that I live with. I wouldn't change it.
Unwanted opportunity. That's a fantastic
unwanted opportunity.
Two-word.
Life is full of them. Yep.
So I love that. That's a great way to look at it. Well, Peg, thank you for pulling us out of a negative pit that I pulled us into for a second there. But that's a great way to. That's a great way to end it.
I dove into that pit.
Very appreciate.
I dove into it with you, but we're out of it.
We are.
We're out of it,
and I appreciate that perspective, getting us out of it. So the book, Higher and Friendly Powers, Transforming Addiction and Suffering. It's. I'm going to pick it up. It's fantastic. I love the summary you sent me, so I'm sure the book is amazing. It's out. It was out last summer? This summer?
It came out in late August. Yep.
Late August. Okay. All right, Peg. Thank you so much. I'll be in touch when this goes live.
Thank you, Vinny.
And this was great. I really enjoyed the conversation.
I did too.
I enjoy your story, personal story, and your work story. So
thanks so much.